Can you hear me?
Sono live.
Hello, we can hear you. We are fixing the camera here. Just a second, we will come back to you.
Great. Chiara Francucci will be the student who will introduce the dialogue.
Però noi ce l'abbiamo fatta. Proviamo un po' a migliorare, però semmai tu digli se possono un attimo avvicinare.
Stanno provando qualcosa sul video. Chiara.
Okay, so
we are connected with the US Embassy with Rakesh Surampudi, Cultural Attaché, and Thomas Smitham, the Chargé d'Affaires. The effects of the COVID pandemic and climate crisis are global challenges that the United States is committed to facing together with the rest of the world. The Chargé d'Affaires of the United States Embassy, Thomas Smitham, will answer questions on US government priorities and efforts to tackle the challenges that lay ahead. Embassy Cultural Attaché Rakesh Surampudi will conduct the interview. Rakesh Surampudi most recently served as Strategic Communications Coordinator in EAP after serving as Country Public Affairs Officer's spokesman at the US Embassy in Jakarta, Indonesia. From 2012 to 2015, Mr. Surampudi was Information Officer and Public Affairs Officer at the US Consulate General in São Paulo, Brazil. His other assignments include the Senior Italy Country Officer, the Office of UN Political Affairs, and positions in London, Islamabad, Mexico City, and Santo Domingo. Mr. Surampudi received a BA in English from Tufts University and JD from Emory University in Atlanta. Thomas Smitham is the Chargé d'Affaires at the US Embassy in Italy. He arrived in Rome in June 2019. Thomas Smitham has served abroad and in Washington in senior positions since joining the US diplomatic service. He was Chargé d'Affaires at the US Embassy in Trinidad and Tobago and political minister counselor at the US Embassy in Mexico City. Thomas has also worked in the US embassies to Peru, Belgium, the UK, and the Holy See. In Washington, he focused on economic policy in the US Department of State, including as Chief of Staff of the Undersecretary for Economic Growth, Energy, and Environment. Tom received a master's degree in international affairs from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and a BA in history from the University of California, Berkeley. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and it's a pleasure to be taking part in the 12th edition of the Festival della Diplomazia. We're very honored to have our Chargé d'Affaires, Thomas Smitham, here during a very busy time in preparations for some important meetings coming up. to talk about US foreign policy priorities and facing today's global challenges. So let's jump right in, if that's fine with you, sir. So let's start. How does the United States approach today's most pressing foreign policy challenges in general?
Well, Rakesh, let me get to that in a second. Let me just also, I can see a lot of you on screen there. Thank you for joining us today. It's a great pleasure also to participate in the Festival of Diplomacy. Also, I just wanted to let you guys know what a charge d'affaires is, because even my mother doesn't really know what that is. So I'm the acting ambassador for the US Embassy here in Italy. In our change of administrations, we haven't named a new ambassador here. So our ambassador left last January. So I fill the role in leading our great team here in Italy. So on your question, Rakesh, the US is a big power and it has a lot of interests. This administration issued what's called an interim national security strategy, which lays out a broad range of US interests. But let me just focus on a few of those. First of all, President Biden was very clear when he came into office that the first priority is to deal with the pandemic. The second priority is to get our economies moving. And that's not just a domestic issue, but that's also part of our international engagement. There are a couple other emerging issues on the international scene that are also very important. There are a whole set of new global threats and concerns, from cybersecurity issues to the role of artificial intelligence, this sort of thing. And that's a big bucket of international challenges for us. And then I'll just highlight two other things. One is we are maintaining a very vigilant look at terrorism and how to protect our societies from global threats of terrorism. And then there is, another issue of trying to make sure that we understand and are able to deal with emerging expansionist powers in the world to make sure that we can keep our societies safe. After all, the nation state has a particular role and goal in all of this, and that is to protect its citizens and to protect its people. So a lot of what you see is how this administration is planning to do that, partly by building and rebuilding alliances overseas, because a lot of those things that I just mentioned can't be done just by ourselves.
So that's great. So talking about alliance and partnerships, what does that mean exactly? And what does that mean really for the relationship between Italy and the United States?
So alliances, as I just mentioned, are key to how President Biden views the world. We are not little islands separated from everybody else without any impact from other countries or other peoples. Some of the global challenges that I just noted require collective action. We can't deal with the pandemic threats. We can't deal with climate change threats. We can't deal with terrorism threats without working with other partners. So this administration has taken a few key steps. One is to reinforce the importance of our NATO relationship with our NATO partners. We have just recently reinvigorated our dialogue with the European Union on a whole range of technology and economic issues. And we've rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement and are now pushing for a global solution to the climate crisis as in partnership with other countries. But the message from this administration and from President Biden is very clear. You can't do this stuff alone. You have to do it in partnership with allies. And that's what this administration is really trying to reinvigorate.
And do you want to talk a little bit about Italy in particular in that context? So
the US and Italy have a very important relationship, and an important relationship in particular on those items that I just identified. We really appreciate Italy's foreign engagement because it's so important to NATO, to our alliance. Italy is involved in peacekeeping operations in Kosovo, in Lebanon, in Iraq. And we work with Italy every day to make sure that we are aligned with them on those issues. Italy also, very importantly right now, has a global role as the chair of the G20. And Italy's driving climate and pandemic preparedness and some of these foreign policy challenges through that important role this year has also been an area where the US and the Italy can collaborate.
And that's great. And if we can sort of pull back to talking about that global pandemic, which you mentioned a couple of times now, can more be done? Does more need to be done to get us to that next place, whether that's a return to normalization?
Well, first, let's take a step back and remember where we were just over a year ago, when the pandemic was running through all our societies without any hope of being able to be checked. And we were faced with lockdowns after lockdown, and an incredible research success was developed through new vaccines, in particular some of these so-called mRNA vaccines, which were developed in partnership with European collaborators and US collaborators, the Pfizer and Moderna ones in particular. So we're in a much different place than we were a year ago in facing the pandemic. But we've all seen that more can be done to overcome this pandemic. First of all, the US, in our global engagement, we have provided over 160 million doses of vaccines to developing countries that are unable to afford them. President Biden hosted a virtual summit on pandemic preparedness and the pandemic just in January, where the US pledged an additional 500 million doses of vaccines for developing countries. We've been involved in COVAX, which is this WHO, World Health Organization effort to make sure that all people can get access to vaccines. And again, Italy has been key in this. Italy has been driving the discussion through the G20. Italy has provided huge donations of vaccines and money to COVAX and to other partners in order to solve the pandemic crisis. More can always be done, and I want to highlight just one other aspect of this, because we're going to be faced with these types of health emergencies over and over again. I don't think that this will be the last one we face. So developing a system for global preparation to handle pandemics through research, financing, mechanisms, and organizations that can deal with this is going to be increasingly important, even as we come out of this crisis.
Yeah, that's great that you mentioned that too, and I'm glad to hear sort of the optimism you have in looking forward to solve that. So let me shift a little bit to what might be even a bigger challenge, climate crisis. You said that word crisis, not just climate change. Can you still talk about that? Are you that optimistic about the climate crisis effort and addressing that issue?
I think the jury is out on whether we should be optimistic on the climate crisis. We know that we have the tools to solve the climate crisis, but this is one of those areas that requires incredible collective action at the international level, but also at the nation state level. Let me first discuss why you might not be optimistic. One is that there's a lot of short-term versus long-term discussions that you have to get into when you deal with climate mitigation. For example, fossil fuels lead to climate change and have caused some of the climate crisis that we're seeing today. Switching out of fossil fuels requires quite a bit of effort and quite a bit of dislocation potentially in employment. So you have to figure out a way to make that bridge from the current dirty fuels that we're burning now to a cleaner future. So the optimism comes in because that cleaner future is possible, and you can build cleaner technologies with solar and wind power and switch over our economies to more electric-based cars, et cetera. We can improve heating in our buildings. We can improve energy efficiency. So there's a lot of optimism that comes after you get over this hump of problems that come from switching your economies over from a, let's call it dirty fuel-based economy to a clean economy. But there are a couple other aspects that come with this. One is financing is going to be very important for this. So global financing for not just Western economies, but the world. And this is one of the aims of the G20 summit, the COP26, so-called climate change summit in Glasgow this year. The other aspect is there's going to have to be some mitigation because we're already faced with changes in sea levels, et cetera. So we have to invest in mitigating the effects of climate change. It's not just investing in switching over to a cleaner economy, but it's also trying to figure out how to mitigate some of the challenges. Venice floods, there are fires in California. These are some of these, the worst aspects of these have been because the climate is changing, and we have to figure out how to solve some of those issues now.
That's great. Thank you for that. And one thing I noticed that I think was a thread in what you were saying earlier, if you could talk about more broadly, is we often hear the phrase shared values and democracy. Can you talk about that and how that's relevant to U.S. foreign policy?
So Winston Churchill once said that democracy is the worst form of government until you consider all the others. The worst form of government until you consider all the others. And that's because those of us who live in democracies understand that there are problems and fights, and it's difficult to reach consensus on things. But nobody's found a better way for people to express their own freedoms and liberties and goals. So it's incredibly important for the US on a domestic level to reinforce our democracy. And we know that we're not perfect. President Biden has called together a summit of democracies at the end of this year, to which, of course, Italy will be invited, to focus on better governance, fighting corruption, reinforcing the values that we hold. I don't think any of you in the room there would want to live in anything but a democracy. At least you're able to vote, you're able to realize your full potential. And authoritarian governments don't have those same goals. And I think for the US, we've always wanted to emphasize the importance of freedom and liberty, freedom of the press, freedom of expression. And those things, as a foreign policy driver for the US, are also extremely important. But I don't want to, this is not an easy thing. And we've seen the faults in our own democracy, which we fully admit. We've seen the problems in other democracies, but compare that to some of the more authoritarian governments and what they do to their own people. And I think it's a way to think through how we all need to recommit to building a better democracy for our citizens at a national level, but also there's a way to collaborate internationally to make sure that happens.
Yeah, and maybe we can use that as a springboard to address a few questions that I know some of the students have had from Tor Vergata University.
Hi students, how are you?
We got one question from Rani Al-Sarakibi, who asked about the future of relations between the US and its traditional allies in Europe and in the Middle East. he pointed out that, it seems like the United States sort of view is shifting more and more towards the East, towards China. So what does that mean for the relationship with these traditional allies and partners that you mentioned before?
So thank you very much for the question. My view on this is that the US is a very big power and it has a lot of interests. I noted a few of those at the beginning. We can have interests in Asia and want to make sure that we are present there and helping to build alliances in Asia while we retain incredibly important relationships in Europe. And as I said as well, we're committed to NATO, we're committed to this transatlantic alliance. Just to give you an example, just between the US and Italy, there's $100 billion with a B, $100 billion in annual trade and in goods and services. So it just gives you the sense of the scale of the relationship. There are 20 million Americans who trace their ancestry to Italy. And this happens throughout our relationships with Europeans, both the trade, the cultural, the personal, the social, the political, the security. All of those aspects are wrapped up in our commitment to the transatlantic alliance. But we've got other issues that we have to face as a big power that Europe also has to face, and that is what happens in Asia. We talked a little bit about democracy. We talked a little bit about trade, about security issues. Those are all very important in Asia as well, and that's a growing part of the world. So the US as an organizing principle for our foreign policy realizes that we have to be engaged everywhere. And just because we are putting a little bit of emphasis on Asia does not mean that we lessen our emphasis elsewhere. It means that we as a big power can retain several emphases at the same time.
Another question we have is from Federico Mancuso. It also has to do with China, maybe a little more directly in the Italian context. He asked that, in recent years, it seems like Italy has been one of the few countries in Europe that has started important commercial and financial relationships with China. What does that mean for Italy and its relationship with the United States?
I honestly don't think it means much for the relationship between Italy and the United States. We all regard China as an important partner in many things. For example, we need to work with China to solve the climate crisis as probably the best example. We also recognize China as a competitor and a threat in some areas, and we need to work to check and to contain those threats, particularly on cybersecurity, some of the threats to our critical infrastructure. And I think we're aware of that. Italy is aware of that as well. But the relationship between Italy and China, the relationship between the US and China is not one dimensional. It doesn't doesn't have one aspect. It's a broad amalgamation, a broad collection of issues. And we need to figure out how to work collectively with China to solve some of our global challenges. And we need to be aware of some of the threats that China poses. And I think Italy is clearly aware of those. The US is clearly aware of those. And we often work together to make sure that we are allied to meet some of those threats and challenges.
Rakesh Smitham, I know you're a very busy person. Want to thank you so much for taking the time to discuss these really important.
Ambassador.
Sure.
Okay, I'm Giorgio Bartolomucci, Ambassador. I wanted to thank you, Ambassador Smitham, for your time. We know that you are very busy with the last and final round of the G20 here in Italy. So I would like to thank you and Councillor Rakesh Surampudi for having accepted some of the questions, all the questions that came from the public. I am sure that if you were able to be here, you would have answered to many more questions that I see in the face of our public. But thank you anyway, because it has been a very great contribution.
Giorgio, do you want to take one more question? I think we have a little bit of time.
One more question, just one more question. Over there, please. Come on.
Um, Thank you, Your Excellency, for this talk today. My name is Yazan Gusus, and I'm from Jordan. And my question is, considering how proud the US is of its own democracy, don't you think it's a bit authoritarian of the US government to force its democracy on other countries? Thank you.
So, first of all, we're not trying to force democracies on other countries. The issue of democracy is that we have found that it's the best way to guarantee liberties, freedom, rights for women, rights for minorities, rights for the press, because it's the only way, it's the only political system that is able to channel all the views of citizens into a political process. If you think of having a monarch who decides everything or a president who decides everything, what happens when people's rights are affected, people's rights are trampled on, people can't realize their full potential? If you are unable to channel that through a political system, then there are no rights for people anywhere in the world. I've already noted that our democracy is not perfect, but what we're trying to do is create a system and develop a system at home, in our case, that allows freedoms to exist and the protection of rights of minorities, of majorities, of the entire country, so that people have freedom, liberty, etc. There are very few other systems where that is possible. So for people to be free, there are very few systems where, unless you have a participatory democratic process, you are able to again guarantee those freedoms. So I don't, we're not usually trying to force this upon people. We're trying to provide an example and, let other countries come along on this journey, but it's not an easy one. And I think this past couple of years has shown that it's particularly not easy, but we've not found another system that works any better.
Great.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Smitham. And the next session we will have after yours is just on shared values. So the students will be able to continue the discussion that you just anticipated in your talk. Rakesh, thank you very much.
It was very nice to be with you guys this afternoon. I hope you find some of those shared values and that they're based on democratic processes after you discuss them. But also really appreciate your time and attention. It's going to be a busy month here in Italy, and I think you'll all see a quite interesting event 10 days from now when a lot of world leaders converge on Rome for the G20 summit. So it'll be an exciting time to be in Rome. So thank you guys all for your attention today. I really appreciate it.
Well, 5 minutes of rest, and then we will have another session at 2:30. Thank you.